Good evening. Welcome to your APTN News Weekend. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Jody Wilson-Raybould says Indigenous rights are no longer a priority for the Trudeau government. The former Justice Minister and Attorney General made the remarks Wednesday at a First Nations Provincial Justice Forum in British Columbia, where she and fellow former Cabinet Minister Jane Philpott were celebrated for their handling of a controversy that's shaken the Liberal Party.
Remarkable, heroic, and inspiration. Just some of the ways Wilson-Raybould and Philpott were described in Musqueam Territory Wednesday.
Ultimately, the lifeblood of colonialism is written in the laws of this country.
But it wasn't all celebratory at the BC First Nations Justice Council's first annual summit.
With respect to Indigenous peoples, the failure to uphold the rule of law in the history of Canada has been one significant factor in the history of Crown Indigenous relations.
Wilson-Raybould detailed how a government that promised reconciliation pushed back against progressive measures like her civil litigation directive on Indigenous peoples.
There were some within the establishment who were fearful that shifting from the norm of how the courts had been used against Indigenous peoples would be a costly mistake.
She said there was also concern among her colleagues that recognizing and implementing Indigenous rights would come with economic risks.
Some who importantly did not, and perhaps still do not, realize that uncertainty, conflict, and unpredictability arise because the denial of rights, not because of their recognition.
While her stand against pressure to intervene in the SNC Lavalin case led to her ousting from the Liberal Party, Wilson-Raybould had unanimous support Wednesday in BC.
You've done a tremendous service to the Indigenous peoples of this country. You've set a very, very high standard, and you've inspired our people from coast to coast to coast.
Former cabinet member and ousted Liberal Jane Philpott was welcomed with the same fanfare.
We have two remarkable individuals. Minister Philpott, Honourable Jane Philpott, who has been the Minister of Health and the Minister of Indigenous Services recently, is well respected across this country by Indigenous peoples.
She said the SNC controversy revealed a serious clash of cultures in Ottawa.
And some have criticized me and Jody as being naive, as not understanding how things are done. Those critics failed to realize that the way things have always been done may not meet the standard of what Canadians expect from their political leaders.
While their time as Liberals has come to an end, both are considering running for another party in the fall election. Given their public commitment to Indigenous rights and a new way of doing politics, the bar is high for the party that may welcome them. Justin Brake, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Now to Saskatchewan, where the Ochapowace First Nation recently evicted a farmer who was leasing their land, but they say he keeps harvesting that land without permission. And recently, he allegedly threatened some band members with a gun. Police were called, but the First Nation feels they weren't taken seriously. The Federation of Sovereign Indian Nations is standing behind the First Nation. APTN's Priscilla Wolf has that story.
The Ochapowace First Nation has been leasing land to non-First Nations and First Nations people for years. Recently, because of lease arrears, they sent a letter of eviction to one of the farmers. But he says he's not going anywhere. When staff went to ask the farmer's son to leave while he was harvesting without permission, they say they noticed a gun.
My staff left the scene because they felt violated and disbelief of what this turned into. The farm's manager then called the Esther Sehazy RCMP and mentioned it's a land dispute and tensions were high. The RCMP just asked if a gun was pointed. The manager just informed the RCMP of the location, and that was it from the RCMP. No further involvement. The RCMP called back to the staff April 24th, yesterday, if they would like to do a statement 8 days later after the incident.
Leaders are disappointed that the RCMP didn't take the matter seriously.
With respect to a trespassing and gun-related incident that occurred on our lands and the inaction of the local RCMP, As a sovereign and self-determining Indigenous nation, we, the Ochapowace Nation government, possess the right to exercise our full authority and jurisdiction over our treaty lands through the implementation and enforcement of our nation laws. As the elected body of our nation government, our mandate is to protect our people and to protect our lands.
Chief Margaret Bear says this seems to be a case of reverse discrimination.
I want to ask a question to the rest of Canada and the rest of our province. What if I was on non-First Nation land with a gun that was exposed and continued to go onto land that I wasn't supposed to be on? What would happen to me? I would probably get shot. If I wasn't shot, I'd be put in remand, thrown in jail until I was charged for trespassing.
FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron is disappointed in the RCMP. He says the police force is supposed to help enforce bylaws on First Nations, and in this case didn't. Chief Cameron said the FSIN and the province were in discussions to sign a relationship-building MOU of understanding. But to support the Ochapowace First Nation, he says he won't be signing it now. Priscilla Wolfe, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
A mother in northwestern Ontario is looking for answers after her daughter was arrested on Tuesday. In a video widely shared on social media, a Sioux Lookout OPP officer can be seen tackling a teenager to the ground. The girl was later charged for assaulting a police officer. The woman who recorded the incident says her family is traumatized by what they saw. Here's Willow Fiddler with this report.
You just threw him down.
Oh my God.
Face first into the cement.
Oh my God.
This video was posted to Facebook on Tuesday evening by witnesses who happened to be driving by when they turned around and caught this on camera. Debbie Wilson Denard said she was driving around Lost in Sioux Lookout with her two daughters when she saw an officer and what looked like a young boy crying. So she stopped and rolled down the window.
And the cop asked, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Well, we're just stopping because it looks like he's in distress."
Wilson Denard says they kept going but turned around out of concern. That's when her daughters started recording and more police show up.
Well, there's 3 more cops coming to help him. He's just a little boy. 2 more.
The little boy turned out to be a 16-year-old girl who police have now charged with 3 counts of assault. In a media release, police say the youth was highly intoxicated. The youth's mother, who arrives at the end of the video, told APTN she had asked the police to help her daughter sober up. She says it broke her heart to see her daughter being slammed to the ground when she later saw the video. Wilson Denard says her family is traumatized by the experience and concerned by the questions from the arresting officer. In the video, the officer tells Wilson Denard a mental health nurse had just arrived on scene, but she said that should have happened sooner.
Where were the youth? Where's the youth person is what I want to know. Where was this mental health lady? Where was a female? Like, where was that mental health worker? Because when she was sitting on the bench crying, I'm pretty sure that, somebody could have been there then.
Okay, can I have your names, please?
I feel like I don't have to give you my name.
Well, you're driving a motor vehicle right now, so you need a license to drive a vehicle.
Am I being stopped for something?
Well, I'm asking you for your names right now, because you just witnessed her spit and kick at me.
Well,
did you not?
No, I did not. I just saw you throw her down. When we came around, that's all I witnessed was you throwing her down. That was the first thing I saw.
So, me being a police officer here to help people, I'm just wondering why you guys are recording me.
I think it's our right to record, just to make sure that everything, as I'm pretty sure, as the public, we have a right to record just to make sure.
Okay, well, I would appreciate it as also the public that when I'm in distress and I'm getting assaulted, that somebody help me too, right?
That's an interesting perspective.
Because being a police officer doesn't afford her the right to assault me, right? Her mom is the one that called her in today. she flagged me down saying that she was intoxicated and that she's actually on conditions not to drink. Her mom was not able to care for her tonight, so I was giving her a safe place to stay. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. You guys have a nice night, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, his comments seemed seemingly ridiculous only because, like, okay, you have the gun, you have handcuffs, you're like twice or 3 times bigger than this person. You don't want me to help that person, but you would like me to, what, tackle this 95-pound person for you? Like, I don't, like, you lost control.
Wilson Denard said she's reached out to the OPP's Indigenous Bureau in Orillia about the incident and will reach out to community services for support. The young girl was released from custody and taken to hospital by her mother. Willow Fiddler, APTN National News, Thunder Bay.
We want to hear what you think. Here's how you can continue the conversation. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca. You can find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptnnews. You can also follow APTN on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more Indigenous news. A Mohawk man has beat charges he was facing from the Canadian Border Services Agency using a never-used-before defense. Now he and his lawyer are hoping that it will set a precedent for others who live in Akwesasne Mohawk territory. Tom Fenario explains.
Right here we're in Gowinoga, as we call it, and over here is the Canadian portion of our territory. That place is the port of entry right here, right underneath that smokestack.
Like most Akwesasne Mohawks, Ganawagelo Jody Swamp knows the Cornwall, Ontario Customs Building all too well.
Everybody on this island, I bet you they must go through there at least twice a day, 3 times a day. You know, a lot of people are going to go get groceries and stuff like that.
In 2017, Swamp was pulled aside at Customs in Cornwall. Swamp was in possession of about $300 worth of firecrackers. He was charged with 3 violations of the Customs Act along with a single charge for transporting explosives, even though he was coming from the Ontario side of Akwesasne.
As soon as I saw this case and read the legislation, I thought doesn't make sense.
What upset Gordon is that the Canada Border Services Agency, or CBSA for short, didn't appear to be following its own rules. So the Mohawk Ojibwe lawyer set out to prove it.
Well, this is the brief that was filed on behalf of Mr. Jody Swamp in the criminal proceedings.
Gordon argued before an Ontario judge that in 2012 before the Senate, the CBSA said that travelers not suspected of coming from the U.S. would be released right away. This was in reference to Cornwall's unique position as the only Canadian port of entry that has both local and international traffic. That's because Akwesasne falls on the borders of Quebec, Ontario, and New York State. This means that travelers coming from the New York side must cross through Gowinoga, also known as Cornwall Island, in Akwesasne, before reaching the Canadian port of entry. Even Akwesasne residents coming from the New York side who live on the island must still pass through customs in Cornwall before they can return to the island. Akwesasne Mohawks make up about 70% of traffic, and Gordon says they are being treated like criminals on their own unceded territory.
And I've been asking myself, why isn't it being challenged? Why is it being continuing? Why am I hearing people in this community talk about discrimination, arbitrariness, harassment?
Last week, Swamp's court challenge won. An Ontario judge ruled that because Swamp was traveling within Canada, he could not be searched without reasonable suspicion.
A weight was lifted off my shoulders, you know, having them come down on me for no reason and having me going through the court system for so long. You know, it was just a big relief.
In an email to APTN News, the CBSA declined to be interviewed and said they are reviewing the court decision and will assess next steps. They have 30 days to appeal the decision. But for now, Gordon and Swamp savor a victory they hope will set a precedent. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Akwesasne, Mohawk Territory.
Minister of Indigenous Services Seamus O'Regan was in Winnipeg this week for the first time since taking over the role in January. He spoke about some investments to Jordan's principal in the 2019 federal budget. The Trudeau government had allocated $1.2 billion over 3 years to help First Nations children access health and social services. Jordan's principal is named after Jordan River Anderson, who spent years in hospital while the province of Manitoba and the federal government argued over who should pay for his care at home. He died in the hospital at age 5.
First Nations children deserve the same opportunity to thrive as all other Canadian children. Jordan's principle legally enshrines a moral obligation that was too often ignored. From July 2016 to March 31st, 2019, more than 218,000 requests were approved for products, services, and supports for First Nations children under Jordan's principle.
It's time for a break, but when we come back, a delegation of Indigenous folks from Canada were at the United Nations in New York advocating for Indigenous rights. We'll have all those details after the break. Welcome back. First Nations leaders from Quebec were at the United Nations in New York City, where they say they have little confidence in the inquiries being done provincially and nationally in Canada on the issue of missing and murdered women. They want the international body to step in and make sure institutional discrimination against Indigenous women is put to rest. Here's Tom Fenario.
Grand Chief Verna Polson began her presentation by quoting the chilling testimony of a fellow Algonquin woman's encounter with Quebec Provincial Police.
I quote, "At one point they parked next to me without saying a word, pushed me into the back seat of the police car. There when I saw they were not taking me to the police station, I said, hey, don't take me to the woods."
Polson is part of a delegation of Indigenous leaders from Quebec who gave a presentation at the United Nations Wednesday night. Their mission is to put an end to the discrimination they say First Nations women in Quebec are facing at the hands of police.
And the conclusion to be drawn is that the system is failing Aboriginal women who face double discrimination.
The delegation points to the dozens of accusations Indigenous women have made against police since 2015, 37 to be exact, ranging from sexual assault and harassment to excessive force, out of which 2 officers were charged.
Nous, les femmes autochtones, on est les meilleures cibles. Le message que l'État est en train de lancer pour les femmes autochtones, c'est vraiment, allez-y, violez-nous, tuez-nous, parce qu'il ne va rien se passer quand on parle du côté judiciaire.
Quebec eventually created an inquiry into Indigenous relations after much outcry. But the delegation told the UN that by not being able to lay civil or criminal responsibility, neither the Quebec nor National Inquiry goes far enough in their mandates.
Although these reports are forthcoming in the coming months, we know already that they're going to fall short in providing answers to too many questions. And we know that the victims will not be satisfied by their conclusions.
The delegation says they want the UN to come to Quebec in September to attend the tabling of the inquiry report, as a way to ensure that the document doesn't end up collecting dust.
Nothing is as effective as the political coercive power of international law and the consequential fear of undermining its external reputation as an incentive for Canada to react and finally act domestically.
Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Montreal.
Still at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, 2 well-known Nunavut Inuit women addressed the delegates. The subject was traditional knowledge, and delegates heard from Nunavut Tungavik President Aluki Kuterek and Inuit singer-songwriter Kelly Fraser. Both stressed how using Indigenous language can help Indigenous kids live better lives. Here's some of what they had to say.
Inuktitut is declining at 1% per year. At this rate, by 2051, only 4% of us will be using Inuktitut at home.
Together we can save the world. My friend killed himself yesterday, and I believe that if we make Inuktitut official in our country, we would save more people.
We've got some amazing Inuit fashion coming up, but first we need to take a break. Stay with us. Welcome back. When Nunavut has fashion shows, they are usually for visitors to the territory. The fashion show in Iqaluit last weekend was a bit different. It was by Inuit for Inuit. Our Kent Driscoll was there.
When you see sealskin snow pants, you know this is a Nunavut fashion show. And to get here took two young Inuit designers teaming up to show off their peers. Victoria Kakuktanik and Melissa Adagutsiak met in Paris this year, where both were showing off their uniquely Inuit designs.
It was very overwhelming. It was kind of like surreal. It was almost like unbelievable until we actually got there. Like, oh my gosh, we're in Paris. What are we doing here? And it was really great. It was such an honor to be there as an Inuit, promoting our Inuit culture and showcasing our Inuit designs. So it was like, we are very honored to be able to do that.
A few months later, here they are with a full-on fashion runway show in Iqaluit, featuring 6 local designers.
We both decided that it would be a really great idea for us to come back to Iqaluit and show our friends and family our garments.
Traditional and modern at once, from the drum dancing intro to those runway scowls. Both fashion and Inuit culture were walking the runway, just like these women wanted.
Really love to see everybody coming together to put on a show. Like, there's so many different things that go into it, and love to bring it back home to where I learned how to sew.
For one night at least, the Kujisi room of the Frobisher Inn became a fashion runway. 2 local fashion standouts gave their peers a place alongside them, and Iqaluit residents supported their local talent with a loud, excited, full house. Iqaluit isn't Paris, and it didn't need to be. Not on this night. Kent Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
A Saskatchewan artist is making portraits of Holocaust survivors and residential school survivors to create a silent dialogue in hope and remembrance. Carol Wiley's inspiration came after she went to the Saskatoon Holocaust Memorial in 2016. Wiley says that she grew up hearing the stories of what Hitler said and did to her Jewish culture and noticed similarities between Holocaust survivors and residential school survivors, in that both concentration camps and residential schools were both final solutions by government. Wiley says this exhibit is her personal call to action.
I feel like it's just a small little step, but I mean, when you listen to one person's story, it can really have an impact on you in terms of understanding what that experience might have been like. And I've heard the numbers of children that went to residential school, but numbers are so abstract. Whereas you hear one person's story, you look in their eyes, you look on their face and hear what they went through, it has a much bigger impact on you.
That's your APTN News Weekend. You can check out our website, aptnnews.ca, if you want more Indigenous news. I'm Melissa Ridgen, and I'll see you back here on Monday. Have a great weekend.